Arrest the cops. Arrest the cops.
Good morning and welcome back to AM Joy. I'm Maria Teresa Kumar. It's been 176 days since Breonna Taylor was gunned down in her own home in Louisville, Kentucky. And today, protesters will again demand justice for her at one of the most popular sporting events of the year. Protests are expected to continue in Louisville today outside of the Kentucky Derby.
Oh, no. No. They can't disturb the Kentucky Derby. You better not disturb the Kentucky Derby. The governor will be down there on you. Just kidding. Not.
Just one of the multiple demonstrations that will take place today after even more protests overnight against the killing of black and brown people at the hands of police. And as these protests continue across the country, so do instances of violence against demonstrators. On Thursday night in Times Square, a car drove through Black Lives Matter demonstrators protesting the death of Daniel Prude, an unarmed black man who died in police custody in Rochester, New York. One of the passengers in that car, Juliet Germanotta, was seen sporting Make America Great Again gear as the protesters were underway. And she has been arrested repeatedly for dumping paint on Black Lives Matter murals outside of Trump Tower. One thing the pandemic has made painfully clear is even when everything else stops, black and brown people continue to be victims of police brutality. And to make matters worse, we have both a president and an attorney general who refuse to acknowledge the systemic racism embedded in American policing and in our criminal justice system.
I do think that there appears to be a phenomenon in the country where African Americans feel that they're treated, when they're stopped by police frequently, as suspects before they're treated as citizens. I don't think that that necessarily reflects some deep-seated racism in police departments or in most police officers. I think the same kind of behavior is done by African-American police officers.
Joining me now is Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. Senator, thank you for joining me. You know, I want to thank you for joining me to talk about this discussion because your life work in public service has been around social injustice and addressing it. You have reached across the aisle and actually created legislation with Ted Cruz to address systemic racism and institutional failures. How does this play to you when you hear our Attorney General, the head law enforcement officer of our land, basically trying to dismiss it?
Well, first of all, Ruth, it's incredible to be on with you this morning. I long admire you and just appreciate your leadership and activism on issues that matter. And to your question, look, this is a substantive, real, measurable problem in this country. It is a crisis. We have a criminal justice system that treats you differently based upon the color of your skin. And this is an opinion. It is demonstrable by the facts and the data. We know, and I've seen Republican attorney generals admit to the fact that we have a problem with systemic implicit racial bias. We know blacks are more likely to be stopped by police and have drugs found on them less. For the same exact crime, blacks are more likely to get a longer sentences. We see consistently throughout the criminal justice system differential treatment. When I sat with William Barr, when he was just a nominee to that office, I took my time where he came to my office to sit and talk to him explicitly about this problem and the urgency to do something about it. So we are at a point now that we have an administration that is denying the facts and the urgency that we are a nation that aspires to equal justice under the law, but we must do work. And the problem is lives depend upon this. And that's why things like our Justice and Policing Act, which is explicitly taking actions to save lives, not just black lives. Mentally ill Americans get killed at a much higher level. We have work to do, and this Attorney General seems to have abandoned that urgency.
Well, Senator Booker, one thing that I find duplicitous is that the president says that we don't have systemic racism, that it is basically a farce and a hoax from progressive liberals, yet he uses the biggest dog whistle that people should be afraid of you going into the suburbs. I have to say that I found one of the most amusing memes that we're seeing because there were pictures of suburban white women with binoculars actually hoping that you would come by. Talk talk a little bit about this duplicity of him of saying we really don't have a problem, but using dog whistles of racism constantly to gin up division in America?
Well, you know, it's a little bit of an absurdity. First of all, my own personal life story. In order to move into New Jersey's suburbs, some of the nicest and most incredible communities in our country, my parents couldn't move into this area and literally had to get to the Fair Housing Council, who got white couples to volunteer on weekends to pose as my parents after they were turned away from housing. So I grew up in this incredible suburban town, as my father used to joke and call us the 4 raisins in a tub of sweet vanilla ice cream. But it took literally a legal intervention. The real estate agent was physically attacked my dad's lawyer, all to grow up where I grew up. But this is the irony of what Donald Trump is trying to do. He's trying to use fear, demagoguery, and rank racism to win an election. This is nothing new. We've seen it with Willie Horton. We've seen it with the tropes about welfare queens. Anything, this is usually coming from the
demagoguery. I put that out just yesterday, pertaining to what demagoguery actually means.
Republican Party in modern era.
The people are uneducated. The people don't realize what's going on. The people don't realize how much that they have been bamboozled by these con artists that come in and project themselves in one way but are doing something completely different in another. The people just don't understand. The people are uneducated. And that's the reason why they need to watch more news and more TV.
That they can do to whip up racism and fear to win an election. And it's just not going to work this time, especially at a moment where we know we have real housing crises in our country with affordability, gentrification, and more. And this is why the Biden team, to me, if you read their housing policy, I literally, as a housing activist since I was coming out of law school,
right.
It made me get up and shout that they are actually having real policies that are going to empower communities and deal with real racial segregation in our country.
Well, and Senator Corey, of all the people that he's trying to create these racial tropes, you literally go into burning buildings and save people. He needs to change that and dial it back, because you are really a cap-wearing superhero. But I want to bring in the rest of the panel, Senator Corey. If you could please join us. I'm bringing in Brittany Cunningham, MSNBC contributor and member of the President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force, MSNBC legal analyst, Butler, author of Chokehold, and Alicia Garza, principal at Black Futures Lab. Thank you for joining me. So, Brittany, I wanted to bring you in because you and I both participated in the President's 21st Century Task Force. And one of the things that was very clear was the importance of changing that culture of the policing. And President Obama and Vice President Biden spoke a lot about the need to change culture and have more community efforts that were hand in hand along with police officers. Speak a little bit about that experience. Speak to that these are issues that have been tried to be addressed by the Obama administration, and then Trump came in and basically zeroed out a lot of those programs.
I mean, not only did the Trump administration come in and zero out a lot of those recommendations, the entire set of recommendations was removed from the DOJ task force, from the DOJ website, rather, pretty early on in the administration. But this administration has actually regressed us beyond that time. They stopped doing some of the things that the Obama administration was doing quite frequently, even before the task force was assembled. So things like consent decrees, in which the DOJ uses federal power to push back on patterns and practices of local municipalities that are continuing to abuse citizens through the institution of policing, were essentially done away with by Jeff Sessions as he was exiting the DOJ and handing things over to the next person. It was like his racist swan song. There were also things in the task force recommendations like independent and external investigations in the situations of police violence and police killings. These are the kinds of things that we see local activists and families demanding right now. But frankly, in some ways, we're past this point, that the very things that communities were demanding in 2015 are different than the things people are demanding in 2020. And that's because of something that we dealt with quite a bit in the task force, what we call legitimacy. It's a very basic idea that any institution that governs people has to be seen as fair and legitimate by those same people. Otherwise, we, the people, will remove our support and approval, which, let's be clear, is what the Declaration of Independence directs us to do. Lest we forget that their founding fathers were protesters. So what's happening? The police continue to kill people. In other developed nations that manage to kill fewer than a dozen people by police each year, American police are killing over 1,000 people every single year. The institution is not serving us. It is not protecting us. And all over the country, you see Americans removing their tacit approval from the institution entirely because it is illegitimate. That's why we say invest in communities and reimagine public safety, because this setup is not keeping the public safe.
Brittany, and you talk a lot.
And to some degree, I agree with that, because I personally feel like that they could use some sort of other tactics, regardless whether it was some sort of netting, that they could throw a net over a person and then captivate that person, or they could use maybe other techniques to incapacitate that person. I don't know if it would be with sound. I don't know if it would be with more phasers. But the fact of the matter is, whenever you have an agency that's hired to protect the people, but is lashing out and it gives the appearance of being part of the problem versus the part of the solution to the problem, then you got a sure enough problem. And of course, whenever you got so many people's lives that have been turned upside down because of the COVID problem, COVID-19, that's lost their jobs, lost their insurance, a lot of them's lost their 401k, a lot of them's lost everything that they had, and a lot of them's fixing probably to become homeless. I do think that the president did issue out some sort of mandate to where your renter could not just put you out on the streets up until 2021, which is give or take about another, 4 months from now. But what's going to happen then? Are people then going to be able to just kick you out because you couldn't afford to pay your rent? I mean, if your rent was $500 a month and you could only come up with $350, does that mean your landlord is going to kick you out because you couldn't come up with the other $150? I don't know. There's a lot of issues here at hand that we just don't have a simple solution to. But for these protesters to antagonize the problem in becoming more than just protesters to the point that they become looters or they become violent towards burning down buildings and lashing out and burning cars and robbing and doing whatever that they're doing, they're creating even that much more of an atmosphere of a problem, a toxic problem, because the message is not being properly addressed. It's actually being hijacked. It's being hijacked by a bunch of thugs that think that the only way that they're going to be able to get their message across is by doing like they done up here in Chicago and do about $70 million worth of damage and stealing about $70 million worth of merchandise. So I can see it from both sides of the perspective. I can see it from the cops' perspective. I can also see it from the general public's perspective towards them lashing out the way that they're lashing out right now. It's a really, really a tough, tight line to walk, a balancing act to do right now. And to some degrees, it's almost impossible. It's going to fall one way or the other. But on this Labor Day weekend, we just need to remember that as long as there's breath, as long as there's life, there's always hope. And as long as there's hope, if we all pull together and get our heads together and wrap our heads around all this, believe it or not, we can get out of this. We can work our way out of this problem that the devil has thrown us off into. So my main message on Labor Day would be don't give up on hope. Don't give up on each other. Don't give up on yourselves.
About tactics and how people have basically come to a better understanding of the full breadth of, sadly, tools at a police department's disposal when apprehending folks. And I want to bring in Paul Butler to talk a little bit more about this. We are now seeing images, sadly, of what New Yorkers are protesting right now, and that is the use of spit hoods. Can you talk a little bit about this? I think that image for me was such a reminder of what we saw in Iraq and how we were using and treating folks that we thought were terrorists. Speak to this and the fact that we're using this practice here in America.
Maria Teresa, if spit hoods remind you of the atrocities at Abu Ghraib or medieval torture devices, you're not far off. It's a primitive way of policing. Basically, cops put a bag over a suspect's head. It's risky, and it can be life-threatening, especially when the suspect is being restrained in other ways. The cops were also holding Mr. Prude down by his head, back, and legs. Because of the danger, New York and Chicago police officers don't issue spit hoods to patrol officers. Almost always when police use spit hoods, it's when someone is in a mental health crisis, and it's much safer to have trained medical providers respond rather than people with guns and spit hoods.
Senator, can you speak about...
Well, my reply on that is, we got vicious dogs. And some of these dogs actually are operated by owners. And if an owner cannot conduct his dog in not wanting to bark or bite the general public, sometimes a muzzle is the right way to go with that particular animal to keep that animal from either biting or barking all the time. I realize that these are probably primitive methods, but at the same time, they're probably the best methods, because whenever you have people that are basically acting like vicious animals, you have to use vicious animal type tactics a lot of times to be able to settle these people down the same way that you would an animal. It's either that or put the animal down. You don't want to have to put the animal down just because the animal is being obnoxious towards keeping the neighbors up at night. So you put a musket over the animal's mouth to where the animal can't no longer bark and yelp 24/7 towards keeping everybody awake at night. Or if the animal has become vicious, you put one of those schnauzers on them that keeps them from biting anybody. We realize that these methods are probably primitive methods, but sometimes that's the methods that you have to use whenever you're talking about some of these hardcore cases. And they are hardcore cases. They're not cases that you run upon just every day. But when you do run upon them, they have to be addressed. Regardless whether it's somebody on PCP that's spitting, that could possibly have some sort of contaminated disease like COVID-19, like the coronavirus. I don't want people spitting on me. And besides that, it's an automatic violation pertaining to the same thing. If you hit an officer, if you spit an officer, it's a violation. It's a crime. You just got to learn to deal with certain situations in certain ways. And it's sad that we have to do that right now, but those are the only alternatives that we know of. I mean, what are you going to do? Super glue somebody's mouth together just to prevent from putting a spit towel over their head? You're going to super glue their lips? You're going to take a needle and thread and sew their lips together to where they can't spit on you? I don't think so. That would even be worse than the spit net. At least the spit net, you can always pull it off whenever the person decides that they're going to straighten up and quit spitting on everybody. It's a very, very uncomfortable subject to have to discuss and talk about, but at the same time, it's one that needs to be addressed pertaining to a lot of people out there that are acting like vicious animals.
with the work and effort that you have
for the protection of the community and the protection of the police officers that is addressing this type of problem. There does come a time with an animal that has become vicious to where putting a schnauzer over their nose is just out of the question. And the only way to deal with that person is to put them down. Now, if they're up to date, rather than killing the dog, they can put the dog asleep. They can use a dart that will inject into the dog's skin to the point that the dog rolls over and becomes incapacitated. I personally believe that they should do the same thing to human beings. If you're dealing with a human being that is that far out of his mind, and there's absolutely no way of controlling that human being, you've tried to net them, you've tried to phase them, you've tried to settle them down, especially if that human being has a gun or a knife and you know that lives are at stake, especially police officers' lives are at stake here, then rather than shoot the person, use a dart. Incapacitate the person long enough to restrain the person. That way, whenever the person wakes back up, you got that person under restraints. Then you can deal with the subject matter at hand. But a bullet is something that you cannot reverse. You can't back it out of the barrel once you engage it. Once you activate the cap on the back end of a bullet head, the lead that comes out of that gun cannot stop halfway into the barrel and be caught back out. You can't stop that lead after it's 100 feet beyond the gun. Once the lead is going, it cannot be retracted. And a lot of times, instead of using lead, it would be better to use a dart to put that individual, to isolate that individual long enough, the same way that you would be a vicious animal, long enough that you could handle the situation. That's the problem that the police officers are facing right now. And of course, whenever you get to dealing with that, then you're going to get to dealing with the doctors, then you're going to get to dealing with the psychiatric community, then you're going to get to dealing with the people that raise flags and say, well, this is unethical, or this is unhumane, you can't do a human being that way. Well, you got a choice. You can either shoot a dart at them and put them asleep, and hopefully that the medication, the stuff that's in the dart, won't be strong enough to stop their heart or to cause medical issues, or you can just go ahead and shoot them with a 9mm that's traveling about 1,400 miles an hour, that once it hits its object, it's going to dislodge atoms into the air pertaining to skin, bone, and tissue. You got two choices. Choice number one, choice number two. Once you've realized that you can't net them, once you realize that you can't phase them, once you realize that this situation is out of control, you've got two choices. You either use a dart or you use a bullet. And why that the police administrations and how come these law enforcement agencies hadn't already done that? It's got to have something to do with either the psychiatric community pertaining to the lawyers or the human rights movement or something. But to me, I would much rather put an individual down by using some sort of strong medication than I would be a bullet. Because the bullet, once the bullet tears through the lungs, once the bullet tears through the bone, once the bullet tears through various tissue, you can't reverse that damage. Yeah, that person may heal, they may live, but they'll be injured the rest of their lives. They'll be walking around with a limp or hurt or a fouled up lung or something the rest of their lives. And there has to be more of a humane way of dealing with these situations other than gassing and blasting people to death. See, that's what they was doing over there in Libya. That's what they was doing over there in the Middle East. They was dealing with high profile cases like this, where whole stampedes of people would come at them and they didn't know what to do. You know, water cannons wasn't working, rubber bullets wasn't working, so they used the last alternative measure, which was gassing their own people. And the sad thing about gassing is that you don't direct gas towards the individuals that's actually involved in the atmosphere of danger, but you gas men, women, and innocent children. You gas the birds, you gas the dogs, you gas everything around in that area. And those that ain't wearing protective shields, protected equipment, they get gassed. And most of the time, that gas that they're using over there in places like Libya, you don't recover from. It not only incapacitates you, but it will kill you. But when you're dealing with strong mobs, and you're dealing with people that are out of their freaking minds, regardless whether they're on PCP, regardless whether it be a gang or a person, one person or 101 persons, you have to use proper protocol in controlling the situation to limit the carnal damage. If you're going to be a law enforcement society that is working above and beyond the board towards being humane.
Tried to champion in the Senate, and where is Donald Trump failing?
Well, first of all, I just want to say your panel, the work we're doing in the Senate wouldn't be possible without the kind of activists and leaders that you have represented in this panel. They're extraordinary people who are part of a nationwide movement. Remember, change from suffrage to civil rights to voting rights doesn't come from Washington. It comes to Washington by Americans who demand it. And that's why I'm just so grateful to be on a panel with these extraordinary leaders. Second of all, we put forward a bill that passed out of the House of Representatives that we have, Kamala Harris and I got about 40 of our colleagues to sign on to. That bill would not have been possible just a year ago without the activism. And it's a very common sense bill, unlike what the Republicans seem to be trying to push, that would not have prevented the kind of no-knock warrant that got Breonna Taylor killed, or the chokehold that got Eric Garner killed, or would prevent the families of George Floyd from holding the killer accountable in federal courts, either civil or criminal. It is a very common sense bill that bans certain practices that we've seen widely supported, the banning of these practices by Republicans and Democrats. We must have policing standards that, as was said by one of your panelists, that are not from a Byzantine era that put people's lives at danger. And the last thing I want to just say about the spit hood that was used in the killing of a man, this was a person that was called because of a mental health issue. We in America have a shameful record of treating the mentally ill, not with health care, not with help, but with hurt, harm, prison, and jail. Our prisons and jails in this country over-incarcerate the mentally ill, putting them in worse danger. And again, African Americans are about 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police.
Now, I agree with what he's saying right here. And Ronald Reagan is the one to thank for this, because it was Ronald Reagan that basically decided that he was going to cut billions of dollars from the government by basically opening up the mental institutions, the people that was housed in psychiatric wards, and put them out onto the streets. And now, 30-something years later, this is what we're all dealing with. It's kind of like I point my finger of the first domino that fell, that lied to the American people, towards read my lips, no new taxes. You cannot go through a colony of people pertaining to the Americans to the point that nobody is paying their fair share of taxes, regardless whether it be the working class or the rich class. It was the Bushes that started that dominoes effect towards no new taxes, read my lips, not my hips, that has put us 30-something years now towards being trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in debt. Trillions of dollars in debt. Why? Because we are no longer functioning as a true government self-sustainable system. Now we're operating off of borrow from Paul to pay Peter, knowing that we're never going to pay Peter back, and we for darn sure ain't going to pay Paul back. You cannot operate this way as a business. So what in the hell is wrong with the American people in thinking that you can operate a government this way? You take all these governors. I'll just use the governors of the state of Tennessee for an example. I think it was Governor Bill Haslam, maybe. I don't know. It was 2 or 3 administrations ago, to where I know for a fact that the governor would allow for Toyota or Nissan or some other car manufacturer to come in down there around Smyrna, Tennessee, somewhere around the Nashville, Davidson County area, may have been 3 or 4 counties over, and they was basically tax exempt for the next like 10 years, that they didn't have to pay not one dime of taxes pertaining to the Tennessee taxes. Well, where else is the money coming from to be able to pay for all these people, these stiffs that walk around in these suits that supposedly makes these decisions with law and everything else, taxes and everything else? Where does the money come from if it's not coming from the richest of the rich, the ones on top, the multi-conglomerates? It's going to come from the workforce. It's just like up here in Martin, Tennessee, in Weakley County. So far, our county taxes that I know of has not been affected. But their city taxes in Martin is just out the freaking roof. It's like 27%. And of course, whenever they're building a building that supposedly started out at $8 million, that's now going to be $14 million, unless they've got some sort of operating skills that they're going to rent out a lot of these spaces to vendors, to where they're going to like turn it into like a mall or something other than just a library, unless they've got some sort of an ideal towards how they're going to be able to pay that money back pertaining to that $14 million building. What do you think the council's going to do in Martin? They're going to try to stiff the citizens in Martin that live in the city limits of Martin, and they're going to raise their taxes. Well, whenever you do that, what happens to the society? They start leaving. They start going out into the country. They get away from those high dollar taxes. The businesses shut down and go to other parts of the county and open up, or they just shut down and stay shut down. In other words, you don't no longer have that service, regardless whether it's somebody selling suits and ties and nice gowns pertaining to people getting married, or it's people buying shoes. You'll no longer have that service in that area because they've done already raised the taxes too high. So once more, we're talking about a tight line walker. We're talking about a balancing act here, to where you got to pay taxes to keep certain industries going. I call them stiffs, people, suit and tie people. But at the same time, you can't give the richest of the rich all the breaks just for them to come into your town or come into your county to be able to open up some sort of conglomerate business like Toyota, Honda, BMW, Volkswagen. Volkswagen just opened up a brand new factory down in Chattanooga. I'm pretty sure they probably got a license the same way that other these conglomerates have. And I'm just mentioning just a few. These are just a few examples of what has went on just within the past 7, 8, 10 years right here in the state of Tennessee. I'm sure there's been many, many more right down there in Shelby County and Memphis that's done the exact same thing. You know, that they welcome them with open arms. Oh yeah, come on, bring it on. Which is very unfair. It's very, very unfair. That's the reason why so many of these carpetbaggers from up north are coming down that was building their product up north, but now they're building it down south. You know why? You know why they're building it down south? Because they get with somebody like the governor, and the governor exempts them for a certain length of time so that they can restructure. In the meantime, as they're restructuring, whenever it comes closer to their deadline, they got one or two choices. They either start pulling their load the way that they're going to pull their load, or they do like the majority of them, and they pick up stakes and they go somewhere else. They go to Alabama. They go to Mississippi. They keep moving. They keep moving around. They keep altering. Because once their 10-year deadline comes up and they realize that they're no longer going to be exempt the way that they was, they realize that the profit share, the profit flow, is no longer going to be as adequate as what it was. So they're going to have to do something, either pay their fair amount of taxes, or declare bankruptcy, or just sell out their business and go to another state. And that's what most of them do. They'll sell out their business and they'll move to another state. Once more, it's a tight line walk. But why these politicians ever started giving the farm away to begin with is beyond me. They have created this monster. Whenever it comes to these big conglomerates not paying their share of taxes, they have created this monster. Just like we have created the monster pertaining to civil rights and treating one sector of people differently than we do another. And I still believe that it's more of a rich-poor issue than it is a black and white issue. Because if I would have had proper representation, people representing me, I could have avoided ever getting a felony onto my life, especially once my story was told properly before the courts, that the whole primary purpose for us even becoming concerned about our neighbors across the road was not to spy on them, but it was because of the concern of 3 little children over there that was being exposed to bad parenthood that was reaching the level of being abused. I personally feel like that if my case would have been tried in front of a jury or in front of a judge, that it would have been dismissed and I never would have wound up getting a felony onto my record to begin with. But as it was, the way that my brother died, the way that I was grieving, I wasn't thinking right. My brother and I had hired bad representation out of Union City. Somebody by the name of Mr. Brown, I believe it was his name. I may be wrong about the name. But it was a dominoes effect to the point that it was just a total catastrophe in my particular life, not just towards me losing a brother at the age of 51, but becoming now a felon. A felon that's exactly what certain people in this area wanted to do, because they was dead set that they wanted to criminalize Juby. They wanted to criminalize Juby because of the anointing that Juby had gotten in his life back in 1988. And because Juby was working so hard out into the general public towards distributing his message as him being the messenger, this was their way of opposing that message by coming after the founder or coming after the messenger. I know exactly what's happened. You know, they can swear off and say all day long, well, there's something wrong with Juby. There's something wrong with Juby. The individual that's talking to you right now. But I guarantee you, if there was something wrong with me, would I be able to figure out my own pitfalls? I don't think so. And I for darn sure wouldn't have to hire an attorney, a hotshot Dvorkian, not Dvorkian, but whatever his name was that represented O.J. Simpson. I wouldn't have to hire somebody like that to represent me because I would already know how to represent myself. Just like me speaking the way that I'm speaking right now about various subjects that we're all being self-induced to, regardless whether it be police brutality or civil rights or taxes. I mean, these are all issues that affects all of us over here, regardless whether we like it or not. Johnny Cochran, the attorney Johnny Cochran, is what I was thinking of a while ago. The one that represented O.J. Simpson. That if the glove does not fit, they must acquit.
Than white Americans, but if you are mentally ill in America, you are over 10 times more likely to be killed by the police. This has to stop in our country. It is so wrong, so backwards, so cruel, and so not becoming of what I believe is the true character and heart of our nation.
It's unhumane. It's unhumane. And I personally don't think that the spit cloth, the spit net, is what actually killed that guy up there in north of New York City. It's called something else, New York. I think it was the brutality that the police officers used, and that's the reason why the doctors deemed it as a homicide. It wasn't necessarily the spit net. You can breathe you can breathe more easier in a spit net than you can a doctor's mask, a surgical mask. And I think the majority of us know how hard it is for some of us to breathe in a surgical mask, especially if you've ever been a smoker or if you've got any type of breathing disorder pertaining to asthma, etc., etc., etc. If you got any weight on you, any age on you, it can be very, very difficult sometimes to breathe out of these masks, especially if you're trying to walk, exhilarate yourself, run, whatever. The spit net that they're talking about is much easier to breathe out of because it has holes everywhere, thousands of them, that actually isn't made to prevent a microscopic germ from either going in or going out. It's just made to conform spit, saliva, in case that individual decides to want to spit on a cop, that it won't be so apparent that you've been spit on. But as far as breathing, that ain't what killed that guy. Putting that net over his head is not what killed that guy. Brutality is what killed that individual. That was on PCP that night. That was stripped off naked.
I think that's absolutely right, Senator. And I want to bring in Alicia into this conversation because you have been doing so much work on Black Lives Matter, but you also speak oftentimes of the alliances between the Latino community and the African American community. In late June, Voto Latino did a poll, and we talked to our audience and found that 70% of them were interested and believed that this issue of motivating the Latinos to vote around racial injustice between blacks and Latinos was imperative. When we look just at young people, it was close to number one. Speak a little bit about how this systemic racism in the police departments bleeds into communities, sadly led with the lives of African Americans, but shortly followed by those of Latinos.
I'm going to leave this at this and saying what I'm going to say right here. They accused Donald Trump using 19th century methods towards trying to prevent the illegal Mexicans from crossing over the Rio Grande by wanting to build a wall. 19th century methods. That's basically what America's doing right now whenever it comes to conforming people that are disorderly, regardless whether they be mentally incompetent or they're just meaner than hell. We're still using 19th century methods on trying to restrict and refrain people that are basically either out of their minds or they're mean, to the point of inducing more harm and hurt into their lives. That's the reason why I think darting people, using some sort of an injection to put somebody asleep. Every police officer ought to have some sort of another gun that is similar to a taser gun, that once they realize that they are not going to be able to phase this person using these electric progs towards stopping this person or slowing this person down, then they should go to number 2 or point number B, which is to use some sort of an injection to try to slow this person down or stop this situation from escalating. And only of the last resort, whenever they feel like that there's no other way of dealing with this, is to be used in the measure of deadly force of pulling out a 9mm Glock and putting a hole in somebody that cannot be removed. That's my opinion. It didn't cost you nothing to hear this. You can debate it, you can think about it, you can cast it out and say, well, this guy here, he's a nut anyway. But my theory is all about life and saving life and giving life a second, sometimes third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth chance again and again, if that's what it takes. You know, my personal life has been spared because of godly intervention more than once, more than twice, more than 3 times, several different times. God has intervened in my life. And I personally believe the reason why that He intervened in my life is for me to make these videotapes on my YouTube platform and to maybe possibly help others out there that get a hold of my material, my work, and they can say, well, yeah, that makes sense in what he's talking about. Let's go ahead and try that and see if that will be more of a solution to the problem rather than a problem. There's nothing wrong with protesting as long as it's done in an orderly form. But whenever it becomes violent or brutal or unethical, whenever it becomes out of hand, then there's serious consequences that goes along with that, regardless whether it be on an individual level or a group level. Thank you for listening. Good luck to all of us on this Labor Day 2020. And may we learn to grow, evolve, and talk and debate and discuss things so that we can possibly better not just our own personal lives, but everyone's lives in the future. Shalom.